as a sort of physical force, all sound is neutral. All sound is the same. It's just waveforms, right, and frequencies. But it's really when you place them in social context that they have meaning, right? Once you ask what is music and what is not music, or what is music and what is sound, you're really asking questions like what do certain cultures value about music, and how do certain aspects of music become more dominant than others? So yeah, I think the goal of a lot of especially electronic or experimental composers is to kind of understand everything we do as music in a way.
Right.
But really, in saying that, they're really just trying to open up people's imaginations to what could constitute
create
music.
A bigger toolbox for what the things to draw from creatively. I'm particularly interested in the idea of conservatism in music today, and there's an apparent sort of conservative view of many musicians and music listeners that electronic music, dance music, things like that, sort of lack the authenticity of, say, a standard group of people that learn their different instruments, guitar, drums, bass, and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about that? What's your take on that? And is it something? Where does it come from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess I'll throw it back into a metaphysical place.
Yeah, that's okay. We can,
so I think it kind of comes from this is a long history in sort of Western culture of about what constitutes. You brought up the idea of authenticity. With sound, that often comes in the form of like, where is the source of the sound? Mm-hmm. And that's how we tell if something is organic or quote unquote authentic, right? And so it goes back to, someone like Aristotle, who said that the voice was the key to understanding the soul, right? So that's a really telling thing, like the idea that when you talk to someone and you hear their voice, that's the most sort of authentic or essential thing to that person's being, right? And so what happens with electronic music, fast forward to the 20th century when all of a sudden you have technologies for sound reproduction, all of a sudden people couldn't discern the source of the sound, and that made people anxious, right?
Yeah.
So if you could play back a recording of a sound, all of a sudden that voice is detached from its source, and this is what people call acousmatic sound.
I see.
So starting in like the 50s and 60s, you had composers like Pierre, Schaeffer, who were experimenting with magnetic tape, cutting magnetic tape, and what they were really trying to do was be able to listen to sound on its own, separate from its source.
I see.
And listen to it in a way as music. And this type of performance really caused a rift in that community of composers, because it was like all of a sudden you didn't have performers playing this music.
I see, right.
So if you went on stage and you just had this recording of a mashed up, cut up tape, and you just hit play, and there's no performer on stage,
it's right.
How do you listen to that?
Exactly.
Right? And that, again, fast forward to the 90s, and with the emergence of electronic dance music and the performance of that music on laptops and stuff like that, it's just an extension of that world. When an audience sees a DJ or an electronic musician performing and they don't see any quote-unquote performance, they don't see the source of that sound, where it's coming from, that's where the anxiety comes from.
So there's that performance aspect that creates this view of a lack of authenticity or realism.
Yeah.
I see these memes on social media sometimes that sort of, they kind of drive me up a tree. Like one of them, for instance, is it's a picture of Beyonce and a list and a picture of Freddie Mercury, and I love Queen. I was a big Queen fan, no problem with that. And it says something like, Bohemian Rhapsody, one songwriter, one producer, one whatever, and then it has Beyonce, 12 producers, 5 writers, and there seems to the idea being like, this is somehow showing that the system of pop music is corrupted by too many hands, and the voice of the artist, the singular artist, is being taken out of the picture. But I think to a larger extent, somehow that she is a lesser musician because she apparently needs all these people involved.
Right.
And the other one is, Kanye West, I think, playing with a drum machine.
Yeah.
And, being compared to Neil Peart from Rush.
Oh, yeah,
Also, I was a Rush fan too. So, and drawing that comparison. And to me, not to get too political, but I sense some sort of maybe possibly latent racism in some of these things.
Absolutely.
And I wonder if that we do seem to have a history in sort of serious music study of sort of looking down on black music as inferior, tribal. And do you feel like this is a continuation of that narrative?
Yeah, I think you totally nailed it on the head. Those are perfect examples of the sort of how these tropes about technology, about popular music versus quote-unquote serious music, how all these things become racialized but also gendered, right? So the Beyonce,
right.
Freddie Mercury one is a very poignant example of that. So really what it comes down to with these things is how... Yeah, I'll point back to your point about this sort of divide that serious composers feel about popular music, right? Mm-hmm. So you have people like, who was it? Karlheinz Stockhausen was he was listening to Aphex Twin, for example, and someone said like, oh, what do you think of this music, right? And Stockhausen said, coming from this very like German serial tradition, classical music tradition, avant-garde, and he said, oh, I could do without it said something like post-African repetitions or something. Like this very sort of racialized idea that sort of there's serious music that requires years of training, and then there's vernacular, popular folk music, which is sort of a lesser form of that.
Right.
And this is something that it's not only a divide in serious, the classical versus popular side, but it's within popular music. You have the sort of rockism, right?
Yes.
So the sort of these often white male rockers who they don't have a taste for contemporary popular music, and then they kind of take it out in these viral videos, these memes.
Right. Yeah.
It becomes a way to assert their music as more quote unquote musical than someone else's. And this again goes back to that question of music versus sound or music versus non-music. Right. It comes from a very specific gendered, cultural, social position.
Right.
That is these sort of white males, maybe born in like the late 70s, 80s, who grew up with a certain type of often white male music, and then sort of feeling threatened by someone like Beyonce or even someone like Justin Bieber. Basically alternative forms of masculinity or alternative forms of femininity that they don't support, right?
I see, right.
And it all plays out in the realm of music, which is the most interesting thing about it.
So you've done a lot of study in the field of digital humanities, and I'm kind of curious if you could give some sort of basic explanation of what the digital humanities are.
Yeah, so it's kind of the running joke with it is that, even digital humanities scholars don't really know what it is. But in a way, that's what attracted me to it. So my perspective of it and my way into it was I was a performer. I was composing electronic music. I was performing as a DJ. I was making hip hop beats. And I went into academia basically saying, what can my perspective on this type of music provide for academics who I felt didn't really understand that perspective. Basically, a design media arts professor, Peter Lunenfeld at UCLA, he calls it the maker's discourse, right? So how do you understand theoretical, cultural context of certain musics from the perspective of the people making it?
I see.
And that, to me, is really the heart of digital humanities, and what it offers is a sort of praxis-based approach to understanding music and technology. So for me, it's collaborating with other fields and disciplines, collaborating with artists, understanding the cultural theory behind these things by performing it, which is actually a very foreign thing to a lot of scholars. Mostly, the sort of whole history of academic work has been based around a certain objectivism, or objectivity, where you for musicologists, you would go to an archive or you do what they call armchair research. And even with ethnomusicologists, they would go into the field and study a sort of what they call other people's music and study it from a very outsider's perspective.
Right.
So digital humanities is kind of a way to study anything really, literature, music, using digital tools from the perspective of the people making the objects that we're studying. It's a way to kind of integrate people in professional worlds and in the industry with academics and scholars, which is again a rift that hasn't been crossed necessarily all the time.
Well, that sort of leads me to another question about being a scholar of electronic music, dance music, hip hop. Have you found it challenging to sort of make your way in that world and gain sort of sort of appreciation and respect as a scholar in that field?
Actually, it's been I'm really lucky to come in at a certain moment where, especially hip hop studies is a pretty accepted field within the academy. Popular music studies as a whole really emerged in the 80s.
I see.
But it wasn't till the early 90s that musicologists and ethnomusicologists started to study this stuff.
I see.
You have people like Rob Walser who wrote this article on Public Enemy and published it in the Journal of Ethnomusicology. And this was sort of a radical thing at the time. This was in 94. And then from then on you started to have books published about it. But at that time, especially for musicologists who were really looking at the music and not just the sort of social context surrounding the music, what they often had to do was use the tools of classical musicology to study it. So, they were writing out sheet music for hip-hop tracks in order to study it and to analyze the forms and techniques. But gradually you start to get people to understand the music on its own terms. You have books like Joe Schloss's Making Beats, The Art of Sample-Based Hip-Hop.
I see.
And once that came out, I think this was 2004 when it came out. Once that came out, he was really talking to producers and understanding how do you think about the music. And again, to bring it all back around, this is kind of the philosophy of music that I kind of apply to too. Is thinking about humanistic scholarship as a much more fluid and holistic thing, in the same way of thinking about music itself in that way. And that leads you down much more experimental paths in terms of how you do research,
Sure.
what you gain and what insights you gain from your research.
Right. So I know you're really busy with lots of other things and musical concerns, but are you making anything yourself these days or doing any performing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I've talked about this before, but the idea of moving across the country it certainly often provides a roadblock to your creative path in a lot of ways. So I was really giving up a lot of the contacts I had, people like yourself, out in New England. But at the same time, it ended up becoming a benefit in a lot of ways because I sort of gained a footing in a whole new world of music. So what I've mostly been doing out in LA, I've been doing a lot of performance as a DJ, so performing electronic dance music, but also getting into the world of sort of sound design and doing projects with faculty on campus. At museums and stuff like that, doing installations.
Okay.
So just to name a couple, I did a project called Rome Lab, which was a virtual recreation of ancient Rome, sort of with this interdisciplinary group that was designed as an online multiplayer video game that was meant for professors to teach students about the history of the Colosseum and the Forum. And I did sound for that. And so that was an interesting project to partake in. And I also did an installation with this Argentinian artist, Maximo Gonzalez, called Walk Among Worlds, where basically he took a bunch of blow-up globes and kind of littered the lobby of this museum with them. Wow. And I did a sort of ambient sound installation to complement that.
Cool.
And that's a lot of the work I've been doing out there. But I also do have plans for a sort of more traditional beat tape / mixtape series called the Back God mixtape. And this is going to be like, hopefully, I'm thinking like straight up electronic dance music that kind of traces a lot of the trends that I've been seeing in LA and elsewhere in that world.
Cool.
So I'm kind of excited to get back into that.
Yeah, definitely. Can you give us a sort of a basic rundown of your setup, what software you use, what sort of gear do you have? Like what's your basically your project studio setup or whatever?
Yeah, I mean that's another thing that has changed a lot over the. You probably saw some of the setups that Jeremy Murphy and I had when we were performing as the Attic Bits, where we have, this MPC with 4 Game Boys, this huge mixer, and a bunch of effects units and keyboards.
Yeah. It was awesome.
And I've gone through gear over the years, like many people who work with electronic music. But again, moving out to LA, I've really slimmed down, and I've actually found a lot of. It's actually been a good thing, I think, in a lot of ways, because sometimes having the gear can stunt you.
Absolutely, I feel the same way. In fact, I talked about that in one of my videos. Is that it certainly can kind of choke your desire, frankly, to get working, because it can be kind of overwhelming, especially if you haven't really created a way that it all works together so that you can just get right to work. But I've always found that, like, the more that personally that I limit what I have to actually have to, tinker with and all that stuff, the more open my creativity can flow.
Yeah.
And, actually just getting work done. So yeah, I definitely with you on that, on the slim setup.
I've really kind of just embraced, basically I just have my laptop with Ableton Live, a few plugins. I'm really into the Native Instruments plugins.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're great sounds, great instruments.
I agree.
And then I use a machine as like my controller.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, I'm a drummer. I'm much more into the world of sort of beat sequencing than maybe synthesis and stuff like that. So I love the grid controllers, where I can, drum out the patterns by myself. But I'm also really into apps. I actually use my phone a lot on the bus commuting. I make a lot of beats just sitting on the bus.
That's cool. And the technology now kind of allows you to do that. Make music on the go anywhere you are.
Right.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Mike. It's great talking to you. Thanks for taking the time. I'll post some links to some places where they can check out your music or your some of your writing. Mm-hmm. And thanks for watching, everybody. This has been The Musical Mind, and you guys take care. Bye-bye.